In older times, when roads were narrower and lamps were fewer, the forest was not treated as scenery. It was treated as a presence that began at the last fence post and continued beyond the last thought. A person could look at a line of trees and feel nothing at all, and another could look at the same line and feel that the day had ended a little earlier than it should have. People did not always describe this in dramatic words. Most of the time, they spoke as if it were ordinary, because it was ordinary. The forest was where wood was gathered and berries were found, where water was followed, where lost livestock sometimes returned on their own. It was where the wind moved without asking. It was where snow collected in ways that made sense only to the trees. It was where a path could be clear in the morning and somehow uncertain in the evening, even if no one had been there to change it. In many places it was said that the forest did not like haste, not in the way a person dislikes it, but in the way deep ground dislikes being struck again and again, patiently, without complaint, and with consequences that arrived later when no one was thinking about them. Those who walked calmly often returned calmly. Those who hurried sometimes returned in a strange mood, speaking too fast, forgetting small things, misplacing tools that had always been kept in the same pocket. These were the kinds of statements that lived in families and villages without ever becoming formal. No book was needed. No proof was demanded. It was enough that the elders said it, and that the young nodded, and that the forest remained where it was. There were practical reasons for this calm caution. A forest can look friendly and still be difficult. Sound travels oddly between trunks. Distance becomes dishonest when every direction contains the same color. A person can move for 10 minutes and feel as if an hour has passed, or move for an hour and feel as if only a moment has gone by. Even in daylight, a shadow can fall in a place that seems too open for shadows. Even in summer, a cold pocket of air can sit close to the ground as if it never learned the season. But folklore does not live only on practicality. It lives on patterns people notice and then remember. A crow that appears when a particular path is taken, a stump that looks different after rain, a patch of moss that seems to grow in a direction that does not match the sun, a quietness that arrives all at once, like a door being closed without a sound. Some believed the forest held its own sense of direction, separate from human direction. A person carries north and south in the mind, but the forest carries near and far in a way that does not always agree. There were those who said a certain grove was close, even if it took an hour to reach, and that another grove was far, even if it could be seen from the edge of the fields. This did not mean the forest changed the world like a trick. It meant that the world in the forest did not always feel obliged to behave like a straight map. In some regions, people spoke of the path itself as something alive in a small way. Not alive like an animal, but alive like a habit. A path that had been walked for generations could be stubborn about remaining a path even when weeds tried to reclaim it. And a new path, one made out of impatience, one cut straight through underbrush, was said to be less trustworthy. It had no memory. It had no agreement with the land. It had not been tested by seasons. That word, tested, matters in old stories. Many things were described as safe not because they were harmless, but because they had been repeated so many times they became predictable. A bridge was safe because feet had crossed it for years. A stone step was safe because it had held weight through winter and thaw. A forest path was safe because it was known and because it did not surprise. And so the advice that often appears in forest folklore is not do not go. It is go in the same way people have gone before. Step where steps have always gone. Pause where pauses have always been taken. Speak quietly, if speaking at all. Keep to the line between the trees and the open. When a place feels different, take it seriously, but do not make it larger than it is. There were also, in many places, markers, small signs that meant something to the people who lived nearby. A bent tree that pointed toward a stream, a cairn of stones at the start of a boggy patch, a strip of cloth tied to a branch left there not as decoration, but as a reminder that someone had passed and thought it worth noting. Some markers were practical and some were not. A few were made to settle the mind. It was said that if a person left something small at the edge of the forest, a pebble, a twig laid across another twig, then it became easier to return because the mind now had a beginning point. The forest did not need the marker, the person did. But people told the story in ways that made it sound as if the forest noticed these things too, and perhaps it did. A forest notices pressure and warmth. It notices what is broken and what is repaired. It notices when the same footstep returns. There are old tales of those who went in without any intention of returning quickly, and those who went in intending to be back before dusk. The ones who intended to return quickly often spoke of the forest's evening voice, the way it sounded when day began to soften. Birds shifting to different calls, leaves making a flatter sound in the wind, the occasional single branch creaking without any other movement. Not every sound was given meaning. Most people were too tired for that. But some sounds received names, because naming a thing makes it less sharp. A dry crack far off might be called a deer. A hollow knock might be called an old tree settling. A thin whistle might be called wind in a narrow passage between trunks. And when a sound could not be named easily, it was often left unnamed and spoken of later with a small shrug. This is how many forest stories begin, not with drama, but with ordinary details that seem slightly out of place. There was a common belief in some areas that the forest had still places, pockets of air where sound did not behave correctly. A person could walk into such a place and find that footsteps sounded too loud or too soft, or that voices seemed to fall straight down instead of carrying forward. It was not always described as frightening. Sometimes it was described as restful. A still place could be a shelter from wind. It could be a place where thoughts slowed down. But there were also warnings about staying too long in those pockets. It was said that if a person lingered in a still place, the mind might begin to treat it like a room, and rooms are not meant to be carried outdoors. In other words, the mind might become comfortable in a way that did not fit the world outside. Then, when leaving the still place, everything might feel too loud, too open, too bright, even though nothing had changed. So people kept moving in a steady way, not fast, not slow. The same pace used when carrying something valuable, but not heavy. The same pace used when approaching a house at night, when it would be impolite to slam a gate. There was also, in many stories, the idea of crossing lines. Some lines were obvious: the edge where forest meets field, the ditch where water runs, the ridge where a path changes angle. Other lines were not visible. They were felt. It was said that when a person crossed into the forest, there was a moment when the air changed. Not always, but often. The smell of dampness became stronger. The light became more filtered. Even the temperature could dip by a small amount. This was described as the forest closing behind. Not closing like a door, but closing like hands coming together in a pocket, making space smaller without touching it. The practical mind can explain this with windbreak and shade, and those explanations are not wrong. Folklore does not always oppose practical explanations. Folklore simply adds a second layer, one made of habit, respect, and a quiet sense that places can have personalities. In villages where the forest was large and the homes were clustered, children were sometimes taught a small ritual without calling it a ritual. They were told to glance back once at the point where the last house could still be seen, not as a superstition, but as a way to anchor direction. Look back once, the elders might say, so the eyes remember. And the children would do it, and then the forest would begin. There were also stories about those who did not look back. In such stories, the person might feel turned around sooner than expected. The person might see a tree that looked familiar and then see it again later, as if the path had looped. The person might find that the forest seemed to offer the same scene more than once, like a repeated sentence. These stories were not always told as punishments. Sometimes they were told as reminders that the mind can be tricked by sameness. A forest of pines can look like 100 versions of itself. A person can become uncertain and then, in the uncertainty, make choices that increase the uncertainty. That is how many people get lost, not by stepping into danger, but by stepping into doubt. So, another quiet rule appeared in older advice. When uncertain, stop. Stand still long enough for the world to settle. When the body stops moving, other senses can catch up. The wind can be noticed. The sun can be noticed. The slope of ground can be noticed. The direction of moss can be noticed, though moss is not always honest. And people knew that too. And then, after standing still, the next step should be chosen calmly, as if it is acceptable to choose incorrectly. This may seem strange, but it is an old kind of wisdom. Panic makes the wrong direction feel urgent. Calm makes any direction manageable. Among the gentler parts of forest folklore are stories about lights. Not big lights, not lanterns carried by people, but small lights seen between trunks, far off, low to the ground. In different places, these lights were given different names. Some called them marsh lights when they appeared near wet ground. Some called them lanterns of the old ones, a phrase that could mean many things and did not need to be clarified. Some said they were simply fireflies, though fireflies did not always live in the same climates where the stories were told. The careful way these stories were told is worth noticing. The lights were rarely described as rushing toward anyone. More often, they were described as drifting, as if they were part of the air. A person might see one, blink, and see it again in a slightly different position. A person might follow it without realizing it, simply because the mind likes to watch a moving point. The advice, if any advice was given, was simple. Do not chase lights, not because the lights were malicious, but because chasing any single point in the forest narrows attention. When attention narrows, the path disappears. When the path disappears, the world becomes the same in every direction. Some told of a hunter who once followed a light and later found himself standing at the edge of bog, unsure how he arrived there. He was not harmed. He did not fall in. He simply stood for a long time, listening to frogs, feeling the ground give slightly beneath boots. He then turned back the way he believed he had come, and the light was gone, and the forest returned to its normal shape. In this kind of story, the light is not a monster. It is a mistake made visible. There were also stories about sounds that mimicked familiarity. A call that sounded like a person calling from a distance, but too soft or too flat. In some villages, it was said that if a voice called from the forest at night and it could not be recognized, it was best not to answer. Not because answering would invite disaster, but because answering establishes a relationship, and relationships take energy. This may seem like an odd way to explain it, but the idea repeats across places. Do not give away breath to something that cannot be seen. Breath is life. Breath is warmth. Breath is time. Better to keep it and walk home and speak inside walls. In other places, the same idea was expressed in a simpler form. If it is real, it will come closer. Real things can be approached. Real things can be met halfway. Imagined things remain where they are. And then there were the trees themselves, which take up much of the old imagination. Trees stand still, but they change constantly in slow ways. They keep scars. They keep marks. They keep the memory of lightning and wind in the shape of limbs. Some believed that certain trees held more stories than others. Old oaks, where they grew, were often treated with a respectful distance. Not fear, but distance. It was said that an old oak had watched too many lives to be interested in one more, and that being noticed by such a tree was not necessary. In pine forests, old pines were said to keep the sound of the sea in their needles, even far inland, because the wind that touches a sea also touches the rest of the world, and a tree does not forget wind. Birches, with their pale trunks, often appear in folklore as boundary trees. They are the kind of tree that looks brighter in dim light. A birch can make a patch of forest look like it contains a doorway, a thin opening of brightness. Some said that birches were placed at the edges of old paths for a reason, because they show where to go when evening comes. In places where people spoke of forest spirits, those spirits were rarely described in a single consistent way. Sometimes they were small and quiet, like a presence that could sit on a stump and leave no mark. Sometimes they were described as taller than a person, but still not dramatic. More like a shape seen out of the corner of the eye, a difference in darkness. And often the spirit was not described at all. It was only implied, a sense that someone else knew the path, a feeling of being observed without judgment. What matters most in sleep-safe folklore is the tone. These presences do not hunt, they do not chase, they do not demand, they simply exist, like wind exists, like cold exists. People who lived close to forests often made peace with this. Peace does not require certainty. It requires routines that keep the mind calm. A routine might be as small as carrying the same walking stick each time. A routine might be humming softly without choosing a melody, so the mouth stayed warm and the throat stayed relaxed. A routine might be stepping on the same side of a ditch when crossing, always the right side, because the habit itself made the movement smooth. Some routines involved leaving something behind. In a few places, it was said that if a person took too much from the forest, wood, berries, mushrooms, without leaving anything, the next trip would feel difficult. So a person might leave a small piece of bread on a stump or a bit of salt on a rock. This was not always framed as payment. Sometimes it was framed as courtesy, the way a visitor might wipe boots before entering a home. Of course, bread left on a stump will be eaten by animals, and salt will dissolve. Practical minds can explain the disappearance. But folklore is not primarily about what happens to bread. It is about what happens to a person's feeling of balance. Leaving something behind makes taking feel less sharp. And then there is the matter of getting home. Many old forest tales end not with a dramatic event, but with a simple return. A person steps out of the trees, sees the field, hears a dog bark somewhere, smells smoke from a chimney. The world becomes wider. The sky becomes larger. The return is often described with relief that is not spoken aloud. People did not always admit relief. They simply adjusted tools, closed a gate, stepped into the yard, and allowed the body to loosen. In that moment, the forest stays behind, but not entirely. It lingers in the mind as a texture, a kind of quiet. It may even linger in the clothes as a smell, and because it lingers, it becomes easier to speak of it. A story can be told at a table, and the teller can pause, and the listeners can imagine the line of trees and the evening air under branches. This is how forest folklore survives, not through shock, but through familiarity. There is, in many regions, a particular kind of story that appears again and again. Stories about the wrong path. Not a path that leads to tragedy, but a path that leads to inconvenience, confusion, and later laughter. A person takes a turn that seems correct, and after time, the forest begins to look unfamiliar in a way that cannot be easily described. The moss seems thicker. The ground seems softer. The wind seems to come from behind when it should come from the side. The person notices these details one by one, and the noticing itself becomes the story. The person turns back, or finds a marker, or follows a stream until it becomes known again. The person returns home later than planned. The person eats, sits by warmth, and tells the story in a voice that makes it sound like a lesson without demanding that anyone learn it. And the lesson, if there is one, is simple. The forest contains more than one version of going through. It contains the straightforward way and the wandering way. It contains the way that gets home quickly and the way that gets home slowly. Some believed that the wandering way appeared when the forest wished to be left alone for a while. Others believed the wandering way appeared when a person's mind was unsettled. The forest, in this view, did not cause confusion. It reflected it. If a person's thoughts ran in circles, the path might feel like it ran in circles too. In calmer minds, the same forest could feel direct. This is not a claim about magic. It is a claim about experience, and experience is enough for folklore. As evening deepens in these old stories, there is often a shift, not into fear, but into softness. The language becomes slower. The details become fewer. The focus turns toward small, steady things, the crunch of needles underfoot, the faint smell of sap, the way darkness gathers around the base of trees first and then climbs upward. People sometimes said that darkness in a forest does not arrive all at once. It collects. It gathers. It settles in low places, then under branches, then in the spaces between trunks. It feels almost like fog, even when no fog exists. And because it gathers, a person who pays attention can feel when it is time to turn back without needing a clock. Clocks were not always trusted in the same way anyway. Time in a forest can feel different from time in a kitchen. In a kitchen, time is measured by boiling and baking, by the length of a task. In a forest, time is measured by light and temperature, by the angle of shadows, by the sound of birds. So when elders spoke of returning before dark, they did not mean a number. They meant a feeling. Before the forest becomes quieter than it should. Before the path becomes more suggestion than certainty. In the next set of old stories, there are often more details about what people claimed to notice when the forest changed. Not into danger, but into something that felt less human. A certain kind of silence. A certain kind of air. And quietly, the idea that the forest has its own rhythms, independent of those who walk through it. For now, it is enough that a forest remains a place of steady patterns, paths, markers, sounds, lights seen far off and not followed, a place where the best practice is calm movement and ordinary respect, a place where stories are not warnings of doom, but reminders that the world is large and that returning home is part of the story. And so these first tales rest where many good forest tales rest, at the edge of the trees where the last light can still be seen and the mind can still remember the shape of the village behind. As the forest appears again and again in old accounts, it begins to take on a quieter role, not as a place where something happens, but as a place where things are allowed to continue without interruption. Many stories do not focus on a single walk or a single evening, but on repetition, on the fact that people entered the forest many times, returned many times, and learned to notice the small differences between one visit and the next. It was often said that no two evenings in the forest were the same, even if the path was the same. One evening might be still, the air heavy and unmoving, the leaves hanging as if waiting. Another evening might be full of sound, with wind passing through the upper branches, setting off a long, gentle movement that never quite reached the ground. People learned to read these differences without naming them. They simply adjusted their pace. In some areas, there were beliefs about the forest's moods. Though this word was not always used, a forest could feel open or closed. It could feel welcoming or distant. This did not mean anything dramatic would occur. It meant only that a person might feel more comfortable stopping to rest, or more inclined to keep moving without pause. Those who spent much time among trees often describe this awareness as something learned without instruction. It arrived gradually, like the ability to tell when rain was coming without looking at the sky. The body knew before the mind found words. There are many stories about resting places in the forest, not camps or shelters, but simple spots where people would pause. A flat stone near a stream, a fallen log that did not rock when sat upon, a small clearing where the ground felt dry even after rain. These places became familiar, and familiarity softened the experience of being surrounded by trees. Some believed that such resting places were known to the forest itself, that they were spaces the forest allowed people to use. Others believed they were simply practical locations chosen over time because they worked. Both explanations existed side by side, and neither needed to replace the other. In quiet folklore, this coexistence of explanations is common. Practical knowledge and belief do not compete. They overlap. When people rested, they listened, not for danger, but for orientation. Listening was a way of placing oneself in space. The sound of water could confirm direction. The sound of birds could confirm time. Even the absence of sound could be informative. A sudden quiet did not always mean something was wrong. Often it meant something small had changed, wind had shifted, or birds had moved deeper into cover. There are stories about people mistaking the quiet for meaning, and stories about people ignoring it entirely. Neither approach was praised or condemned. The forest did not require interpretation. It required presence. In some regions, it was said that the forest listens back. This did not mean the forest reacted to words. It meant that the forest responded to movement. A person who moved gently encountered gentler conditions. A person who thrashed through brush encountered resistance. Branches caught sleeves. Roots caught boots. This was not punishment. It was feedback. Children who were taught to walk in the forest were often taught by example. An adult would step carefully, not because the ground was fragile, but because careful stepping creates fewer surprises. When the body moves smoothly, the mind stays calm. Old tales sometimes include a figure who walks too loudly, speaks too much, or refuses to notice where they are. This figure is not a villain. They are simply inexperienced. Their stories usually end with embarrassment rather than harm. Arriving late, losing direction briefly, having to ask for help. These stories were not meant to scare. They were meant to teach rhythm. There are also stories about objects found in the forest, things that did not belong to the forest but were not immediately claimed by anyone else. A dropped glove, a broken tool handle, a piece of cloth caught on bark. Such objects often took on a quiet importance in stories, not because they were valuable, but because they represented passage. Someone had been there before. Someone would likely come again. In some places, people believed that leaving lost objects where they were found was the correct thing to do, not because the object was cursed or special, but because moving it without knowing its story felt wrong. The forest, in this belief, was not a place for collecting what was not clearly given. In other places, the belief was the opposite. Lost objects were brought back and placed at the edge of the forest where they could be seen. This was said to help people find their way. The forest, in this telling, was not offended by such acts. It simply observed them. These differences in belief tell us something important. Forest folklore adapts to the people who live near the forest. The stories do not force a single truth. They reflect habits. Another recurring theme in old forest stories is the idea of near silence. Not total silence, which rarely exists, but a quiet so steady that it feels like silence. When people spoke of this, they often described it as calming rather than alarming. The absence of sharp sound allowed thoughts to slow. In such quiet, small sounds become noticeable. The movement of insects, the distant knock of wood on wood, the slow release of air from the forest floor as temperatures change. These sounds are not signals. They are background. And yet, because they are noticed, they become part of memory. A person may later recall an evening in the forest not by what happened, but by how it sounded. There are gentle stories about people falling asleep briefly in the forest. Not deep sleep, but a kind of drifting rest. Sitting against a tree, feeling warmth through clothing, closing eyes for a short time. These stories are told carefully, often with a reminder that such rest was taken in familiar places, near known paths, during daylight. The rest itself is not treated as dangerous. It is treated as human. The forest in these stories does not punish rest. It simply continues. As night approaches in many tales, attention turns to edges again. The edge between forest and field. The edge between tree line and sky. The edge between movement and stillness. People learned that staying too deep into the forest after dark made navigation harder, not because something changed suddenly, but because the same landmarks became less visible. So the habit was to begin returns before darkness fully settled, not in haste, but in readiness. A person might pause, adjust clothing, check that tools were secure, and then walk back with the same calm pace used earlier. There are accounts of evenings when the forest seemed reluctant to let go of sound, when wind continued longer than expected, when branches creaked late. There are also accounts of evenings when the forest fell quiet quickly, as if drawing a blanket over itself. Both were considered normal. Some believed that the forest preferred certain times of year for quiet. Late summer evenings, when insects slowed. Early winter afternoons, when snow absorbed sound. In these times, walking felt softer, and stories told later reflected that softness. The seasons play a large role in forest folklore. Spring brings movement and unpredictability. Streams swell, paths soften, sounds multiply. Autumn brings clarity. Leaves fall, sightlines open. Footsteps become louder. Winter brings simplification. Shapes reduce. Directions become clearer, even as cold increases risk. These seasonal changes appear in stories not as dramatic backdrops, but as expectations. A person entering the forest in autumn expects a different experience than in spring. That expectation shapes behavior, and behavior shapes stories. There are also stories about smells, something rarely emphasized but quietly present. The smell of wet leaves, the smell of resin, the smell of cold earth. Smell anchors memory strongly, and many people later describe a forest experience through smell rather than sight. A person might say, "It smelled like autumn," and that would be enough. In some traditions, it was said that the forest keeps the memory of fire longer than the memory of water. Burn marks linger, charcoal remains, water passes through. This belief led to care around fire use, but also to a sense that some events leave longer traces than others. This idea carries into storytelling. Loud events are remembered longer. Quiet events fade sooner. And yet, it is often the quiet events that shape habits. Among the more subtle beliefs are those concerning direction. In a few regions, people said that the forest feels different depending on the direction one walks. Walking toward the rising sun felt lighter. Walking toward the setting sun felt heavier. This was not treated as a rule, but as an observation. Others said direction mattered less than intention. A person walking with a clear reason felt steadier than a person wandering without purpose. The forest, in this view, responded to clarity. It is easy to see how such beliefs arose. A clear goal reduces hesitation. Reduced hesitation reduces mistakes. Reduced mistakes create smoother experiences. Smooth experiences become stories of ease. And so forest folklore often emphasizes calm intention rather than courage. Courage implies confrontation. Calm intention implies alignment. As stories continue, they often shift focus toward small interactions. A bird crossing a path, a sudden opening in the trees, revealing sky, the sound of water where no water was expected. These moments are noted, not interpreted deeply. The forest does not need to be solved. It needs to be moved through. In some villages, there were sayings about not taking the same path every time, not because the forest punished repetition, but because familiarity can dull attention. Taking a slightly different route kept the senses awake in a gentle way. But this advice was balanced by another. Do not take an unfamiliar route when tired. Balance appears again and again in these tales. And then there are stories that do not center on people at all, but on the forest continuing when no one is there. Trees growing slowly, paths narrowing, clearings closing. These stories are not told with sadness or urgency. They are told as facts. A forest does not require observation to exist. It grows whether watched or not. This idea often leads to a kind of calm acceptance in old stories. A person is temporary. The forest is steady. Both can coexist without conflict. As the night deepens in these accounts, human details fade. Tools are put away. Voices quiet. The forest becomes a presence again, not a place of activity. People speak of this transition without emphasis, as if it is the most natural thing in the world. And with that, the stories begin to drift toward quieter moments, toward evenings when nothing in particular happened. But the memory remained because it was undisturbed. In the next set of stories, attention turns toward the deeper forest, where paths thin and beliefs grow softer, less specific, and more like impressions than narratives. And there, the beyond the familiar paths and resting places, many old stories speak of the deeper forest, not as a separate realm, but as a gradual change. The trees do not suddenly become different. The ground does not announce itself. Instead, the forest slowly shifts from a place shaped by frequent passage to a place shaped mostly by time. People who entered these deeper areas often did so with purpose. They were not wandering. They were following a stream to its source, checking traps set long before, or gathering wood that grew farther from the village. The deeper forest was not forbidden. It was simply less adjusted to human rhythm. In such places, the forest floor often felt softer, layered with years of fallen leaves and needles. Footsteps sounded different there, more muted, as if the ground preferred not to echo. Light filtered through more layers of branches, breaking into smaller fragments before reaching the ground. These details appear often in recollections because they signal a change without requiring explanation. There are stories about people noticing that their thoughts changed in the deeper forest, not dramatically, but gently. Worries that felt sharp near home became duller. Plans lost urgency. Time felt less structured. Some said this was because the forest removed distractions. Others said it was because the mind adapted to quieter surroundings. Both ideas existed together without conflict. In these areas, people often described a sense of being held, not restrained, but contained. The forest felt closer, the space between trees narrower, even when the distance was the same. This feeling was not always pleasant or unpleasant, it was simply noticed. Some believed that the deeper forest did not care to be understood. It did not resist explanation, but it did not offer one either. When something unexpected occurred, a sound without a clear source, a sudden change in wind, it was accepted as part of the place, not as a sign. This acceptance appears frequently in older stories. Rather than asking why, people asked what to do next. And often the answer was nothing. Stand, listen, continue when ready. There are accounts of people stopping in the deeper forest not to rest, but to orient themselves internally, closing eyes briefly, taking a slow breath, letting the body settle. These moments were described later not as decisions, but as pauses that seemed to arise naturally. In some traditions, it was said that the deeper forest responded better to stillness than to movement. A person who stopped moving would notice that the forest continued on its own terms. Birds resumed their calls. Insects returned to their rhythms. The sense of being observed softened, not because observation ended, but because it became mutual. This idea of mutual presence is subtle but important. The forest does not become passive when watched. It simply continues. Old stories also mention changes in temperature that occur without obvious cause, a coolness that settles briefly, then lifts, a warmth that lingers near a fallen trunk. These changes were not interpreted as warnings. They were interpreted as signs that the forest contained layers of air, just as it contained layers of soil. In places where mist formed easily, people told stories of fog that moved slowly between trees, changing shape without wind. Such fog was often described as calming. It softened edges. It shortened sight lines. It made the forest feel smaller and more manageable. There were, of course, practical reasons to treat fog with care. But in folklore, fog was not a threat. It was a reminder to slow down. In a deeper forest, paths often became suggestions rather than instructions. A faint depression in the ground, a slight clearing between shrubs. People followed these not because they promised efficiency, but because they promised continuity. Someone had walked there before, even if it had been long ago. There are stories about finding traces of older paths, paths that no longer connected anything important. These traces were sometimes followed out of curiosity, sometimes avoided out of respect. It was said that walking an old path meant stepping into a story that had already finished. This belief did not carry fear. It carried a sense of quiet closure. A finished story does not demand attention. It simply exists. In some regions, people believed that the deeper forests contained places that were best left unnamed, not because they were dangerous, but because naming them created expectations. An unnamed place could be approached without assumption. This idea appears in stories about clearings that never received names, even though they were known. People would say, "the clearing beyond the second bend," or "the open place near the fallen spruce." These descriptions were functional and temporary. They did not turn the place into a destination. Naming, in folklore, is often linked to control. What is named can be called. What is called may feel obligated to respond. The forest, in many traditions, was allowed to remain partly unnamed. Another recurring theme is the way sound behaves differently in deeper forest areas. Echoes are rare. Sounds are absorbed. A dropped object may land without the expected sharpness. This softening of sound contributes to the sense of containment. People described feeling closer to their own movements in such places. The sound of breathing, the sound of fabric shifting. These sounds became more noticeable simply because nothing competed with them. In stories told later, these details often appear without emphasis. A person might say, "It was very quiet," and that would be enough to convey the experience. There are gentle tales of people losing track of time in the deeper forest, not in a dramatic way, not hours passing unnoticed, more like a sense that time loosened its grip. A task that felt long did not feel tiring. A walk that should have been short felt full. These stories do not present time loss as danger. They present it as a different mode of attention. When the mind is not checking time, it moves differently through space. In some traditions, it was believed that the deeper forest had its own way of marking time, not by hours, but by changes in light and sound. A certain bird call meant afternoon was passing. A particular stillness meant evening approached. These markers were learned through repetition, not instruction. People who trusted these markers often described feeling more at ease than those who relied on external measures. The forest, in this view, provided what was needed if attention was given. There are also stories about unexpected clearings found deep within the forest. These clearings were often described as surprising rather than welcoming or threatening. A sudden openness after long enclosure, sky visible again, light falling directly on the ground. Such clearings were sometimes used as resting places, sometimes passed through without stopping. The decision depended on how the clearing felt at that moment. Folklore does not insist on a correct choice. The feeling of a place mattered more than its appearance. In some stories, a clearing might feel unfinished, as if it had been created by a fallen tree or a past fire and not yet reclaimed. In others, a clearing felt old and settled, surrounded by mature growth. These differences were noticed, but rarely interpreted. The deeper forest also appears in stories about animals, though animals are not central characters. A deer crossing quietly, a bird lifting from the ground without alarm. These encounters are mentioned briefly as confirmations that the forest remains active even when quiet. Animals in these tales are not messengers. They are participants in the same environment. There are occasional references to sounds that resemble human activity, wood striking wood, distant movement, but these are rarely developed into narratives. They are acknowledged and then left alone. The deeper forest, as it appears in calm folklore, is not a place where something must happen. It is a place where many things are possible, and none of them demand attention. As evening approaches in these deeper areas, the forest often seems to draw inward. Movement slows, sound reduces, the sense of enclosure increases. This is not presented as a warning, but as a natural transition. People who notice this transition often began turning back before it fully settled, not because they feared what would come next, but because they respected the rhythm. Returning from the deeper forest is described differently than returning from the forest edge. The transition feels longer. The first sign of familiarity, a known tree, a familiar bend in the path, carries more weight. It signals not relief, but recognition. And with recognition comes a subtle shift in the body. Muscles loosen, breathing changes, attention widens. The deeper forest remains behind, not closed off, but unchanged by departure. It does not need acknowledgement. In the stories that follow, attention often moves toward what happens when people do not return immediately, when they stay longer than planned, not by mistake, but by choice. These stories do not escalate. They soften further, focusing on endurance, patience, and the quiet companionship of place. And so the forest continues, deeper and quieter, offering nothing urgent and receiving whatever presence is given without demand. There are a number of old forest stories that linger on what happens when a person remains longer than intended, not because of confusion or misdirection, but because the moment feels settled. In these accounts, staying is not framed as a mistake. It is framed as a decision made without urgency. People spoke of evenings when work took longer than expected, or when light remained soft enough that there seemed no reason to rush. In such moments, the forest did not change character. It simply continued, allowing the person to remain within it. In these stories, staying longer often meant becoming more aware of small comforts, the way a trunk supports a back, the way the ground gives slightly when weight shifts, the way air feels cooler closer to the soil. These details become important not because they are remarkable, but because they allow the body to relax. There is a recurring idea in forest folklore that comfort does not belong exclusively to built spaces. A house offers warmth and enclosure, but the forest offers a different kind of steadiness. It does not adjust itself for human use, and because of that, it remains predictable in its own way. Some believed that the forest preferred those who adjusted themselves instead. Stories told later often describe this adjustment as subtle: shoulders lowering, breath slowing, movements becoming smaller and more efficient. The forest does not instruct this change. It simply provides a context in which it occurs naturally. There are many quiet accounts of people sitting without purpose in the forest, not waiting for anything, not watching for signs, simply sitting. These accounts do not contain dialogue or revelation. They contain stillness. In some places it was said that such sitting allowed a person to hear the forest settle. This did not mean the forest changed. It meant that the person's awareness changed enough to notice what had always been present: a steady background of sound, a consistent rhythm beneath variation. It is in these moments that stories sometimes mention a sense of companionship. Not the companionship of another person, but the companionship of place. Being somewhere that does not require explanation can feel supportive. This feeling was not always described in positive terms. Sometimes it was described as heavy or dense. But even when described this way, it was not treated as threatening. It was simply the weight of presence. In forest folklore, weight is not always something to escape. Sometimes it is something to lean into, briefly, before moving on. There are also stories about small tasks done deliberately slowly in the forest: sharpening a tool, tying a knot, sorting gathered items. These tasks appear in stories because they anchor attention without demanding it. The hands work, the mind rests. Such tasks often mark the transition from activity to return. They create a pause that allows the body to prepare for movement back toward home. In some regions, people believe that leaving the forest too abruptly could create a sense of restlessness later, not because the forest was offended, but because the body had not completed its adjustment. Taking a few extra moments, standing, breathing, listening, helped smooth the transition. This belief reflects an understanding of rhythm. Entry and exit matter. As dusk deepens in many accounts, light becomes more horizontal. Shadows lengthen, details flatten. People spoke of this light as revealing shape rather than color. Trees become silhouettes. The ground becomes a continuous surface rather than a collection of objects. This change in perception is often described without emotion. It is simply noted. The forest, at this time, appears older, less detailed, more unified. There are stories about sounds becoming easier to locate as light fades. During the day, sound can be scattered by visual distraction. At dusk, sound becomes more central. A snapped twig carries farther. A distant call feels clearer. These observations are not framed as danger signals. They are framed as orientation tools. In places where the forest bordered water, evening brought additional changes. Moisture in the air increased. Smells deepened. Sound reflected differently. These sensory shifts are included in stories because they mark time without requiring clocks. Some people believe that the forest was most itself in the hour before full darkness, not because it became more active, but because human presence became less dominant. The forest's rhythms became easier to notice. This belief often appears in stories told without emphasis, as if it were a shared understanding. There are accounts of people beginning their return during this hour, moving with care but without anxiety. Tools were packed, items were secured, the body shifted toward homeward movement. In these accounts, the return path is not described in detail. It does not need to be. The emphasis is on continuity. The same trees, the same bends, the same markers. Familiarity asserts itself quietly. Some stories mention a brief moment of hesitation during return, a pause at a fork, a glance toward a side path. These moments are not dramatized. They are resolved through habit rather than decision. Feet turn where they have turned before. Habit, in forest folklore, is a form of trust. There are also stories about unexpected encounters during return, not encounters with beings, but with weather, a light rain beginning, a sudden wind. These are accepted as part of the forest's cycle. Rain, in particular, appears often in calm stories, not storms, but steady rain. The sound of drops on leaves, the way the forest smells after the first moments of wetness. Rain softens edges and simplifies choices. When rain falls, the forest becomes less about sight and more about sound and touch. People who walked in light rain often described feeling insulated. The forest absorbed the sound of drops, creating a steady background that allowed thought to drift. These descriptions carry no urgency. Rain is not an obstacle. It is a condition. In winter stories, dusk arrives earlier and more decisively. Light fades faster. The forest simplifies more quickly. In such accounts, return is often planned earlier, but not rushed. Snow absorbs sound. Footsteps become muffled. Direction becomes clearer through contrast. Winter forest stories are often quieter than summer ones. They contain fewer details because fewer details exist. This reduction is often described as comforting. There are also stories about the forest at night, though these are usually brief. Night is not a separate realm. It is an extension of dusk. People who walked at night did so on known paths with clear purpose. These stories emphasize familiarity. The forest at night is not entered casually. It is entered knowingly. In such accounts, the forest does not change. The person's perception changes. Darkness removes detail. Attention shifts inward. The forest at night becomes a place of movement without observation. Steps are taken without watching feet. Hands find familiar objects by memory. Breathing becomes more noticeable. People did not linger in these stories, not because of fear, but because lingering offered no advantage. And so return completes itself. A field opens, a fence appears, a structure interrupts the line of trees, the forest ends without ceremony. What remains is not a sense of escape, but a sense of transition completed. The forest, once left, does not call after those who depart. it remains where it is, unchanged, available for the next visit. In the next set of quiet tales, attention often turns toward the forest as it exists without people at all, overnight, through seasons, through long stretches of time when no footsteps mark the ground. And in those stories, the forest becomes less a place to move through and more a presence that simply continues. When people spoke of the forest continuing without them, they did not usually describe dramatic scenes. There were no sudden transformations or hidden events revealed in the absence of human eyes. Instead, the stories focused on persistence. Trees remained standing, paths softened, leaves fell and gathered, snow came and went. The forest carried on in a way that did not require witnesses. Some believed that the forest changed more during times when no one visited it, not because it acted differently, but because time was allowed to move without interruption. Branches grew into spaces that had once been kept open. Young trees rose in places where feet had compacted the ground. Old clearings slowly narrowed. These changes were not considered losses. They were considered corrections. The forest returned to its preferred shapes when left alone. In long stretches of calm folklore, people describe the forest overnight as quieter, but not empty. Night was not treated as absence. It was treated as continuation. The same sounds existed, but fewer of them were noticed. The same movements occurred, but without attention. There are accounts of early morning walks where people returned to the forest after a night away. These stories often describe the forest as feeling settled, as if it had completed something while no one was present. Dew lay evenly on leaves. The air felt balanced. Sounds resumed gradually. Morning light, filtered through branches, appears often in these stories. It reveals detail without urgency. Shadows retreat slowly. Colors return gently. The forest does not wake suddenly. It stretches. Some people believe that early morning was the best time to notice the forest's continuity. Footprints left the day before had softened. Small disturbances had blended back into the ground. Evidence of passage faded without effort. This fading was not treated as erasure. It was treated as absorption. The forest does not remove signs of presence. It incorporates them. In some regions, people spoke of the forest as a place that keeps its own company. This phrase did not imply solitude. It implied completeness. The forest did not wait for interaction. It did not depend on activity. It existed fully without attention. This belief often appeared alongside a sense of humility. A person's visit mattered in the moment, but not in the long view. Stories told with this understanding tend to feel calm rather than small. Being temporary did not reduce value. It clarified it. There are gentle stories about people noticing that the forest felt unchanged after long absences. A path taken months earlier still led where expected. A familiar bend still appeared at the same moment. This reliability fostered trust. At the same time, there were stories about subtle differences noticed only after time away. A tree fallen since the last visit. A stream altered slightly by runoff. These changes were accepted as natural adjustments rather than disruptions. In forest folklore, change is rarely framed as threat. It is framed as movement. Seasonal cycles appear frequently in stories about long-term absence. Winter simplifies the forest. Spring complicates it. Summer fills it. Autumn releases it. Each season leaves traces that prepare for the next. People who return to the forest after a full cycle often spoke of recognition rather than surprise. The forest did not feel new. It felt familiar in a different way. Some believe that the forest remembers seasons more clearly than people do. A person might forget how deep snow lay the previous winter, but the trees carried a memory in broken branches and bent trunks. The ground carries the memory in compacted layers. This belief led to a quiet respect for age. Old trees were not valued only for their size, but for their accumulation of seasons. Standing near such trees was said to make time feel broader, less personal. Stories about age in the forest rarely include awe. They include steadiness. An old tree does not impress. It remains. In places where people spoke of forest guardians or watchers, these figures were often described indirectly, not as beings with tasks, but as presences that ensured continuity. A guardian was not something to encounter. It was something assumed. In some traditions, the guardian was nothing more than the forest itself, personified for ease of speech. In others, it was an unnamed presence that did not interact. These ideas were rarely expanded upon. They did not need development. They served as background, not plot. There are also stories about how the forest responds to repeated absence. When paths go unused, they soften. When clearings go unvisited, they fill. This response is not emotional. It is mechanical and patient. People who noticed this did not feel excluded. They felt informed. The forest does not hold space open indefinitely. It responds to use. This understanding appears in advice passed down quietly. Return occasionally if a place matters. Not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. The forest, in this view, does not belong to anyone. It accepts presence without obligation. As stories drift further into this perspective, they become less about events and more about states. Being in the forest, being away from it, returning, leaving again. These states repeat without emphasis. There are accounts of people standing at the forest edge after long absence, noticing a subtle hesitation before entering. Not fear, but adjustment. The body remembers different rhythms and must align again. This alignment happens quickly when given space. A few steps in, a pause, a breath. The forest resumes its role. In calm folklore, this moment is often the most important, though it is rarely highlighted. Entry matters more than depth. Exit matters more than distance. The forest does not demand commitment. It allows passage. In some regions, people believed that speaking less upon return allowed the forest to settle around them again. Silence was not required, but it was comfortable. This preference for quiet appears often in stories told with age. Younger voices describe movement. Older voices describe stillness. As the forest continues overnight, over weeks, over years, it gathers these small patterns of human interaction and releases them without record. Stories, remember, what the ground does not. And so, forest folklore becomes a way of holding memory lightly, a way of acknowledging place without trying to fix it in meaning. As the night deepens in such stories, there is no need to describe darkness again. Darkness has already been accepted. What remains is continuity. In the next portion of old tales, attention often shifts toward how people spoke of the forest to one another, how stories were shared, repeated, softened, and allowed to fade over time. And there, the forest becomes not only a place, but a shared understanding, carried quietly from one voice to another. When forest stories were shared among people, they were rarely presented as important announcements. They were woven into conversation slowly, often at the end of a day, when tools were put away and nothing urgent remained. Someone might mention a walk taken earlier, a change noticed, a sound heard and then forgotten. Another might nod and add a similar memory without insisting on connection. In this way, forest folklore accumulated without structure. No one set out to record it. It lived in repetition, in agreement, without discussion. People often told these stories while doing other things. Hands worked while words passed. Attention drifted between task and memory. Because of this, the stories themselves learned to tolerate distraction. They did not require focus. They did not build toward conclusions. They existed comfortably alongside movement and silence. This manner of telling shaped the stories as much as the forest shaped the experiences behind them. A story told while working cannot demand too much. It must pause when the work pauses. It must resume without explanation. It must accept interruption. And so forest stories became layered rather than linear. There are accounts of the same story being told differently by different people, each version quieter than the last. Details softened, edges blurred. What remained was not accuracy, but tone. The listener learned how the forest felt, not what happened. In many regions, elders were known for telling stories that did not seem to go anywhere. They would begin with a memory, move through several unrelated observations, and then stop, as if the rest no longer mattered. These stories were not corrected. Their value lay in the atmosphere they created. Younger listeners sometimes expected endings and did not receive them. Over time, expectations changed. This change in expectation is important. Forest folklore does not reward anticipation, it rewards presence. A story that does not resolve teaches the listener to rest with uncertainty. There are stories about people asking questions and receiving answers that did not quite match. A question about direction might receive a response about weather. A question about distance might receive a response about time. These mismatches were not misunderstandings. They reflected the way forest knowledge was shared. In the forest, knowing where you are is not always the same as knowing where you are going. Stories reflect this distinction. In some places, people believed that speaking too precisely about the forest made it feel smaller. Overdescription reduced mystery, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. A forest reduced to measurements loses depth. So stories stayed general, deep, quiet, old, thick, These words do not map, they evoke. There were also customs around when forest stories were told. They were often avoided at midday when light was sharp and attention was elsewhere. They were favored in the evening when boundaries softened and listening required less effort. Evening storytelling created a natural rhythm. The day ended. The night began. The forest fit into this transition easily. In some households, stories were told without any particular audience in mind. They were spoken into the room rather than to a person. Children might listen. Adults might half listen. The story did not adjust. This way of speaking reinforces the idea that stories do not belong to listeners. They belong to the space in which they are told. They are gentle accounts of stories being interrupted by silence and then not resumed. No one felt the need to finish. The story had served its purpose by existing for a while. In forest folklore, silence is not absence. It is continuation without words. Some people noticed that certain stories were told only in certain seasons. Winter stories differed from summer ones. Winter stories emphasized stillness and clarity. Summer stories emphasized growth and sound. Autumn stories emphasized change. Spring stories emphasized uncertainty. These seasonal preferences were not rules. They were habits. Stories told in winter often involve standing trees, frozen ground, and long pauses. Stories told in summer involved movement, insects, and shifting light. Each set of stories matched the environment outside the walls. This alignment made the stories feel grounded without needing explanation. In villages near large forests, there were sometimes shared phrases that appeared in many stories, short statements that meant more than they said. It was quiet enough. The path held. The trees were close. These phrases did not need elaboration. Such phrases acted as anchors. They allowed stories to remain brief without losing meaning. People who heard these phrases often knew what was meant without thinking about it. The forest, through repetition, had taught them. There are also stories about how forest tales change when told away from the forest. A story told in a town feels different than the same story told near the tree line. Details shift. Emphasis moves. Far from the forest, stories become more descriptive. Closer to it, they become more restrained. This pattern suggests that distance invites explanation, while proximity invites familiarity. Some believed that the forest itself influenced how stories were told nearby. The quiet outside encouraged quiet inside. The steady presence of trees reduced the need for emphasis. Whether this belief is accurate matters less than the effect it produced. Stories told near forests tended to be calmer. There are also accounts of people forgetting forest stories over time and then remembering them suddenly when returning. A smell, a sound, a particular light would bring back fragments. These fragments were not always complete. They did not need to be. Memory in forest folklore is not archival. It is associative. People remembered feelings before details, a sense of calm, a sense of enclosure, a sense of movement through space without pressure. And so, forest stories were often retold not to preserve facts, but to recreate conditions, to bring back a way of being. As these stories passed from one generation to the next, they changed pace. Older tellers spoke more slowly. Younger tellers added movement. Over time, the stories adjusted to the listeners. Yet, beneath these changes, the forest remained constant. In the quietest stories, the forest barely appears at all. It is implied rather than described. A pause, a mention of shade, a reference to returning home. The forest fills the space between words. This restraint is one of the reasons forest folklore remains effective for rest. It does not demand visualization. It allows the mind to supply or withhold images as needed. As the telling continues, stories become shorter. Sentences lengthen, details thin. The voice carries less information and more tone. Eventually, the forest stories reach a point where they are no longer stories at all, but patterns of speech that signal rest, familiar phrases, familiar rhythms. And at that point, the forest has done what it often does in folklore. It has become a backdrop for stillness. In the next portion, the stories ease further away from people and language, settling into descriptions of the forest as it exists in long stretches of time, where events blur into continuity, and nothing in particular needs to be remembered. When forest stories move beyond people and words, they often become simpler, not because there is less to say, but because saying less begins to match the subject more closely. The forest, over long stretches of time, does not present itself in moments. It presents itself in continuity. In these quieter accounts, the forest is described as a pattern rather than a place. Light moves across branches. Shadows shift slowly. Growth happens without urgency. Decay happens without drama. These processes do not require witnesses. People who thought about the forest in this way often spoke of it as something that holds time rather than measures it. Time passes through the forest without leaving clear marks. A year looks much like the one before it. Change is distributed evenly. There are stories about standing in the forest and feeling that many other moments exist there at once. Past footsteps, future footsteps. The ground does not distinguish between them. It supports all equally. This idea is rarely expanded upon. It is allowed to remain a feeling. In some traditions, it was believed that the forest grows more quietly when left alone for long periods. Growth does not slow, but attention does. Without attention, change feels smoother. People who returned after many years often remark that the forest felt both familiar and distant. Familiar in shape, distant in detail. This combination created a sense of calm recognition without attachment. Such experiences are not framed as reunions. They are framed as acknowledgments. The forest does not greet, it receives. There are accounts of people walking through areas where old paths had fully disappeared. No trace remained except a faint difference in vegetation. These places were not treated as losses. They were treated as completions. A path that is no longer needed returns to ground. The forest absorbs it without effort. In long-term stories, the forest becomes a reference point for patience. Trees do not hurry. Soil does not resist time. Everything proceeds at a pace that does not react to observation. People sometimes use this as a model. When unsettled, they would recall the forest's pace, slowing breath, slowing thought, allowing things to be unfinished. This use of the forest as a mental reference appears quietly in folklore. The forest is not a teacher, it is an example. In some places, it was said that the forest is most present when nothing is being done, when no one is gathering, cutting, or traveling. In these moments, the forest is allowed to exist fully as itself. Stories that reflect this belief often contain very little action. They might mention standing, listening, waiting without expectation. These stories can feel empty to those seeking events. To those seeking rest, they feel complete. There are also beliefs about how the forest responds to weather over long spans. Rain does not interrupt it. Snow does not burden it. Heat does not exhaust it. These conditions pass through without leaving urgency behind. People who spent time in forests often adopted this outlook. Weather became something to experience rather than manage. In such accounts, discomfort is acknowledged without emphasis. Cold is felt. Wetness is felt. Tiredness is felt. None of these require reaction beyond adjustment. This calm acceptance appears frequently in stories told late, when voices are low and attention is loose. As stories continue, they sometimes lose their connection to a specific forest entirely. The setting becomes any forest. The details become interchangeable. This abstraction does not weaken the story. It strengthens its usefulness. An unnamed forest can belong to anyone. At this point, forest folklore often blends into something closer to description than narrative, a sense of enclosure, a sense of continuity, a sense of being within something that does not ask to be understood. These descriptions do not build, they settle. There are moments where words seem almost unnecessary. The voice continues not to convey information, but to maintain rhythm. In these moments, the forest becomes a background for breathing. Sentences lengthen. Pauses increase. Meaning thins. This thinning is intentional. It mirrors the way attention softens as rest approaches. In the quietest accounts, the forest is no longer described at all. It is implied through the absence of urgency, through the steady pace of speech, through the lack of contrast. The forest remains present without being named. And so, these old forest stories conclude not by ending, but by gradually letting go of detail. They leave behind an atmosphere rather than a memory. What remains is a sense of steady presence, a sense that nothing needs to be followed, a sense that time can pass without demand. The forest, in this telling, continues beyond the story. It does not close. It does not resolve. It simply exists. and the voice, having carried these impressions for a while, no longer needs to add anything further. It is enough that the forest remains. After the stories have thinned and the forest has become more suggestion than place, what remains is not narrative, but presence. In old tellings, this is often where words become slower, more evenly spaced, and less concerned with description. The forest no longer needs to be introduced. It is already there. People once said that when the forest is quiet for long enough, it begins to feel wider rather than deeper. Space opens instead of closes. The sense of enclosure softens into something steady and broad. Nothing presses in, nothing pulls away. This feeling was sometimes compared to standing near water at night, when the surface cannot be seen clearly, but its extent is understood. The forest, like water, does not require constant attention to remain present. In these moments, stories often return to simple observations. The ground holds warmth longer than the air. Trees cool more slowly than open fields. The forest releases heat gradually, as if reluctant to let it go all at once. Such observations are not meant to inform. They are meant to slow thought. There are accounts of people walking without destination during these quiet hours, not traveling far, not seeking anything. Their movement is described as gentle and unmeasured. A few steps, a pause, another few steps. This walking is not exploration, it is alignment. The forest, at this stage in the telling, becomes less external and more like a condition. It is something one is inside of, rather than something one looks at. Descriptions shift accordingly. Instead of naming trees, stories speak of shade. Instead of naming paths, they speak of direction without distance. In some traditions, it was believed that the forest contains places where thought naturally slows. These places were not marked. They were recognized by feeling alone, a sense that nothing needs to be decided there. People who found such places often stayed briefly and then moved on without comment. The experience did not need to be shared to be complete. There are gentle stories of sitting until nothing in particular is being thought. Breath moves on its own. Sounds pass without being labeled. The forest exists without requiring response. These stories are not about meditation or intention. They are about allowance. As night deepens in these accounts, the forest does not change character. It simply reduces detail. Edges soften. Distinctions blur. What remains is shape without outline. In such darkness, the forest is not hidden. It is simplified. People sometimes said that darkness makes the forest honest. Without light, there is no decoration, no distraction, only presence and movement. This idea appears without explanation. It is offered and left. In the quietest tellings, the forest is described through absence. No wind, no call, no sudden movement. This absence is not emptiness. It is steadiness. The absence of interruption allows the body to settle fully. Stories at this point often repeat certain rhythms without repeating information. Sentences follow similar lengths. Pauses arrive at familiar intervals. The voice becomes predictable in the best possible way. Predictability allows rest. There are accounts of people noticing that their awareness begins to widen in these moments. Attention spreads rather than narrows. Thoughts arrive and leave without forming chains. The forest does not direct this process. It allows it. In some regions, it was said that the forest carries many nights at once. The night just past, the night to come, nights long gone. These nights overlap without conflict. Standing within this overlap can make a single night feel less important, less urgent, less demanding. This belief does not diminish the present. It softens it. As stories continue in this manner, they begin to resemble the sound of walking itself. Step, pause, step, pause. No destination announced. The forest remains constant. The voice remains steady. Eventually, there is nothing left to add without disturbing the balance that has formed. Words become fewer. Meaning becomes thinner. Rhythm carries what content once did, and so the forest is allowed to be what it has always been in calm folklore. A place where time stretches, attention loosens, and nothing requires completion. The voice continues for a while longer, not to say something new, but to maintain the quiet that has already settled. And then, without needing to stop or end, it simply continues on its own. In the longest forest tellings, there comes a point where the stories no longer introduce ideas at all. They rest instead on continuity. The forest is no longer approached or left. It is simply present, like a steady background that does not require attention. People once described this stage as the forest holding the night, not actively, not intentionally, but in the way ground holds weight and air holds sound. The night settles into the spaces between trees and remains there evenly distributed. At this point, descriptions become minimal. A sense of coolness near the ground, a faint movement of air high above, the quiet persistence of trunks standing where they have always stood. These details do not combine into scenes. They remain separate, like slow breaths. The forest, in these accounts, does not ask to be understood. It offers a condition of steadiness. A person within it does not need to make decisions. There is nothing to choose. Stories told this way often circle gently around the same sensations without naming them directly. The feeling of being supported by ground. The feeling of being sheltered without enclosure. The feeling of time moving without pressure. These feelings are not explained. They are allowed. In some traditions, it was said that the forest becomes easier to be with the longer one remains quiet, not because it changes, but because attention simplifies. The mind stops reaching for contrast. Everything becomes similar enough to rest within. There are accounts of standing still long enough that the sense of standing fades. Weight distributes evenly. Muscles release without instruction. Breathing finds its own depth. The forest does not respond. It does not need to. At this stage, stories often lose their sense of sequence. There is no before and after. There is only during. The forest exists during. People who told these stories rarely noticed when they stopped speaking. Words thinned and then paused. Silence filled the space without being marked. If speech resumed, It did so gently, without explanation. A phrase might appear, then another, some time later. The pauses were part of the telling. This rhythm reflects the forest itself. Growth does not announce itself. Movement does not demand recognition. In such tellings, the forest is sometimes compared to a long breath held comfortably, not strained, not forced, simply held. Time within this breath stretches, minutes feel wide, moments feel complete. The forest does not care how long this lasts. There are also stories where the forest is described as a kind of balance point, a place where the weight of thought evens out. Concerns lose their edges, expectations soften. This is not described as relief. It is described as neutrality, a return to a steady state. As the voice continues, it becomes less informative and more consistent. Tone carries meaning more than words. The sound of speech becomes the primary feature. At this point, listeners in old households often stopped listening actively. The story became part of the room. It accompanied rest without directing it. The forest, in this role, serves as a setting that does not intrude. It allows the mind to disengage without leaving. Descriptions, when they appear, are brief and familiar. Shade, cool air, stillness. These words do not create images so much as reinforce a condition. The forest does not end. It does not resolve. It remains. And so the telling continues in this way, quietly, evenly, until words are no longer needed to maintain the sense of presence that has formed. Nothing has to happen next. The forest holds, and the voice rests within that holding, steady and unchanged. As the forest remains present without requiring attention, the telling becomes almost incidental. Words appear, not to add meaning, but to keep the rhythm from breaking. The forest does not need description anymore. It is already established as a steady condition. In old accounts, this stage was sometimes compared to walking a familiar path in low light. Feet know where to go without guidance. The body moves without instruction. Thought follows rather than leads. The forest, at this point, is no longer a place one enters. It is a place one is already within. There is no threshold to cross, no edge to notice. People who spent long hours near forests often spoke of this state as being in between, not asleep, not alert, present without effort. This state was not sought after. It arrived when conditions allowed it. Stories told in this way do not progress. They remain. The voice continues with gentle observations that do not demand images, a sense of coolness that remains constant, a stillness that does not feel empty, a balance that does not require adjustment. In these moments, the forest feels less like a collection of trees and more like a single presence, not unified in shape, but unified in rhythm. Everything moves slowly, or not at all. There are accounts of people noticing that even memory becomes quieter here. Past and future lose importance. The present stretches comfortably. The forest does not influence this directly. It provides a setting where nothing competes for attention. Language, when used, becomes repetitive in structure, but not in content. Sentences are similar in length. Pauses occur at familiar intervals. The sound of speech becomes predictable. Predictability allows the body to rest. In old households, this kind of telling often accompanied the end of the day. Lamps dimmed, movement slowed. The story did not need to be finished. It needed only to continue until it no longer mattered. The forest, in these stories, becomes a place where nothing is expected. No discovery, no conclusion, only continuity. Descriptions, when they appear, are soft and unremarkable. Ground beneath, air above, space around. The forest holds these elements without emphasis. As the voice moves forward, it does not introduce new ideas. It maintains an even pace. The sound of words carries calm without content. There is no need to remember what was said earlier. There is nothing to return to. Everything necessary is already present. The forest remains steady. The voice remains steady. And in this steadiness, the story fulfills its purpose, not by ending, but by allowing attention to drift away without resistance. Nothing more is required. By this point in the telling, the forest has become a quiet constant. It no longer shifts or develops. It simply remains, holding the same steady balance from one moment to the next. Words continue, but they do so gently, without introducing anything new that would ask for attention. In old traditions, this stage was never marked. It arrived naturally when enough had already been said. The forest did not need more description. The mind did not need more detail. Stories told this way often linger on sensations so familiar they no longer form pictures. Cool air resting on skin, the ground offering steady support, the sense of space extending outward without edge. These sensations are not framed as experiences. They are conditions. The forest, in this condition, does not invite exploration. It invites rest. Movement becomes unnecessary. Thought becomes optional. People who described this state rarely spoke of it directly. They spoke around it, allowing silence to fill the center. Words acted as borders, not content. In these moments, time loosens its structure. Minutes do not stack, they spread. The idea of passing time fades into the background. The forest does not mark time. It holds it. There are accounts of sitting or standing long enough that the distinction between the two no longer matters. The body finds its own balance. Muscles release without instruction. Breath settles into a pattern that requires no thought. The forest does not respond. It does not need to. Speech, when it continues, does so at an even pace. The tone remains unchanged. There are no rises or falls to follow. The sound of the voice becomes part of the environment, like distant wind or steady water. At this stage, stories often include phrases that carry no information but maintain rhythm. Familiar words, soft transitions, gentle continuity. The forest remains present beneath these words, unchanged. Nothing in these tellings needs to be remembered. There is no sequence to follow. There is no meaning to assemble. The story exists only to accompany rest. In many old households, this was the point where listening faded naturally. Eyes closed, attention softened, words passed without registering. The forest continued, whether heard or not. There are no endings here. There are no conclusions. The telling does not resolve because nothing was unsettled. The forest remains as it has always been, steady, quiet, and unconcerned with being understood. And the voice, having carried this steadiness for a time, continues on without effort, allowing everything else to settle around it. As the telling continues, the forest remains unchanged. There is no new direction to take and no depth to reach. Everything necessary is already present, held quietly in place. The voice moves forward without purpose other than continuity. In the oldest versions of these calm forest tellings, words eventually became interchangeable. One phrase could replace another without altering the feeling. Meaning was no longer carried by content, but by steadiness. The forest, at this point, is not a subject. It is a condition. It surrounds without enclosing and supports without holding. People once described this state as being within the trees, not in a physical sense, but in a mental one. Thought no longer presses outward. It rests. Descriptions, when they appear, are minimal. Coolness, still air, the faint sense of ground beneath. These elements repeat gently, not as reminders, but as background. The forest does not react to attention. It does not change with observation. It simply remains, offering the same quiet presence from moment to moment. Stories told in this manner were never meant to be finished. They continued as long as they were needed and faded when they were not. Silence took over without announcement. In some households, the voice telling such stories would lower slightly, not to signal an ending, but because the room itself had grown quieter. Words adapted to the space they occupied. The forest in these tellings does not close. It does not recede. It remains accessible without being entered. Nothing more is required to be said. The voice continues softly, evenly, allowing the forest to remain exactly as it is. The forest by now exists without description. It does not need to be named to be present. The voice continues not to explain, but to maintain a steady rhythm, allowing everything else to remain undisturbed. In the quietest tellings, even familiar images begin to soften. Trees are no longer individual forms. They are vertical presence. Ground is no longer textured. It is simply support. Air is no longer moving or still. It is just there. This reduction is not loss. It is settling. People once said that when attention rests long enough, it naturally widens. Thought does not stop, but it no longer clusters. It spreads evenly, without focus. The forest provides a setting where this spreading feels natural. Nothing competes for attention. Nothing insists on meaning. At this stage, the voice becomes part of the environment rather than a source of information. Words pass without accumulation. Sentences dissolve as they arrive. The forest remains steady beneath this flow, unchanged by listening or silence. In some traditions, this state was compared to standing under a canopy so familiar that it disappears. The shelter remains, even when it is no longer noticed. There are no stories left to tell in the usual sense. There is only continuation. The forest does not require closure. It does not require departure. It allows presence without instruction. And so the voice continues, evenly and without intention, until it no longer needs to carry anything at all. Nothing follows. The forest remains. The forest remains without effort. Nothing changes because nothing needs to. The voice carries on softly, not to add detail, but to keep the rhythm unbroken. In this stage of the telling, words serve only as gentle markers of continuity. They do not describe events. They do not point forward. They rest where they are spoken and then pass. The forest, held in this way, is no longer a collection of sensations. It is a steady condition that does not shift with attention. Whether noticed or not, it stays the same. People once spoke of this quiet as something that could be entered repeatedly without becoming smaller. Each return felt familiar without feeling limited. The forest did not wear out. Descriptions, when they appear, are almost abstract. A sense of balance, a sense of weight evenly distributed, a sense of space that does not press inward or outward. These are not observations. They are states. The voice remains calm and even. Pauses arrive naturally. Nothing is emphasized. Nothing is concluded. There is no story to finish because there was no problem to resolve. The forest continues and the telling continues just enough to let everything else settle. Nothing further is required.